A single gunshot shattered the silence of a North Carolina home, and when police arrived, there was no intruder, no break-in, no stranger fleeing into the night, just a woman on the floor, and her husband standing over her. LeTonya Gidney Bradshaw was 49 years old, a woman who showed up for everyone around her, family, friends, her community. The kind of steady, grounding presence that people leaned on without even realizing how much they needed her. The kind of woman who remembered birthdays, who checked in on people, who never made her pain anyone else's problem. She never made it out of her own bedroom. Her husband, 36-year-old Michael Keith Bradshaw, made the 911 call himself, and the first thing investigators noted, before they even processed the scene, was how he sounded on that call. Not shattered, not frantic, not like a man who had just watched the woman he married bleed out on the floor in front of him. Calm, measured, controlled. Police arrived to find no forced entry, no broken locks, no overturned furniture, no evidence that anyone had come in from the outside, no signs of chaos at all. Just a quiet house, a closed bedroom door, and LeTonya gone from a single gunshot wound at close range. Neighbors told officers they had heard arguing earlier that night, two voices rising, heated, and then one sharp crack that ended everything, and then silence so heavy it was almost louder than the noise before it. What really happened behind that closed door? Was this a marriage that finally reached its breaking point, or a man who made a cold, calculated decision the moment he realized his wife was ready to leave him? Because here's what the evidence would eventually reveal. This wasn't chaos, this wasn't panic, this wasn't two people fighting and something going tragically wrong. This was something far darker. And LeTonya Gidney Bradshaw deserves to have every piece of it brought into the light. You're watching The Exposed Crime. We tell the stories that need to be told. Domestic violence, toxic relationships, and the lives lost behind closed doors. No sugarcoating, no excuses, just the truth. If you're new here, subscribe and join us as we shed light on stories. LeTonya Gidney Bradshaw was not supposed to become a headline. At 49 years old, she had built a life defined by presence, the kind of woman who didn't need to be the loudest person in the room to be the most important one. People who knew her used the same words over and over when they described her. Steady, warm, reliable, the type of person who showed up to family gatherings, to community events, to the quiet, unglamorous moments when someone just needed another person there. Her photos reflect exactly that. Soft smiles, calm, open eyes. Nothing about her image suggests drama, recklessness, or a life lived on the edge. She looked like a woman at peace, someone who had figured out who she was and was comfortable in that. But photographs don't show what happens behind closed doors. LeTonya was married to Michael Keith Bradshaw, 36 years old, 13 years her junior. The age gap drew quiet looks from people in their circle, the kind of sideways glances that people politely don't turn into conversations. Maybe it worked for them, maybe it didn't matter. People make their choices, and you respect them. Except, the older the relationship got, the harder it became to ignore certain things. The arguments, for one. Neighbors had heard them before, not once, not twice, but enough times that it registered. Voices carrying through the walls of that house, sharp and heated. The kind of fighting that has weight behind it, that isn't just about dishes in the sink or someone forgetting to pay a bill. Real tension, the kind that builds over time and doesn't fully disappear when the voices finally drop. But nobody called it in, nobody knocked on the door, because from the outside, it still looked like a house, a marriage, a normal life. Friends of LeTonya noticed a shift in the months leading up to September 2025. She seemed quieter than usual, more guarded, like she was carrying something she hadn't decided how to put down yet. Some described her as distracted, present in the room, but somewhere else in her head. And then there were the conversations, small, serious, slipped into moments that didn't announce themselves. LeTonya had started talking about leaving. Not dramatically, not in tearful confessions or crisis mode phone calls, just quietly, with the kind of quiet resolution that comes after a long time of internal debate. She had made her mind. She just hadn't made her move yet. Nobody who heard those conversations raised a red flag. Nobody connected the exhaustion in her eyes to danger. Nobody thought the arguments next door were anything more than a rough patch that would pass. Then came September 1st, 2025, and LeTonya Gidney Bradshaw never got the chance to make that move. The 911 call came from inside the house. Michael Keith Bradshaw placed it himself, and from the very first moment, something felt wrong. Not because of what he said, because of how he said it. His voice on that call was composed in a way that didn't match the situation he was describing. No hyperventilation, no sobbing, no screaming her name, no desperation, none of the raw emotional unraveling you'd expect from someone who had just watched the woman he married bleed out on the floor in front of him. Calm, measured, controlled. Police arrived to find no forced entry, no broken locks, no overturned furniture, no evidence that anyone had come in from the outside, no signs of chaos at all, just a quiet house, a closed bedroom door, and LeTonya gone from a single gunshot wound at close range. Neighbors told officers they had heard arguing earlier that night, two voices rising, heated, and then one sharp crack that ended everything. And then silence so heavy it was almost louder than the noise before it. What really happened behind that closed door? Was this a marriage that finally reached its breaking point, or a man who made a cold, calculated decision the moment he realized his wife was ready to leave him? Because here's what the evidence would eventually reveal. This wasn't chaos, this wasn't panic, this wasn't two people fighting and something going tragically wrong. This was something far darker. And LeTonya Gidney Bradshaw deserves to have every piece of it brought into the light. By the time the sun came up, Michael Keith Bradshaw was no longer just the husband who made the call. He was the only suspect that made sense, and the investigation was just getting started.
When someone becomes a suspect, investigators stop looking only at what happened. They start pulling apart everything that led to it. The marriage of LeTonya and Michael Keith Bradshaw was about to be dissected in the most unforgiving way possible. Detectives requested financial records, phone logs, bank statements, and insurance documents. What they uncovered was a relationship under serious compounding pressure. There were money problems, not the kind that arrive suddenly and shock a couple into teamwork, but the slow, grinding kind that erode the foundation of a relationship over months and years. Bills, strain, the quiet financial desperation that makes everything else harder and every argument carry more weight than it should. The phone records told their own story. Text messages between LeTonya and Michael in the days leading up to September 1st were short and cutting. No warmth, no resolution. Just two people exchanging words that had long stopped being about fixing anything and had become about landing points. Sharp, final. The kind of texts that read less like a couple in conflict and more like two people who had already, on some level, decided something. And then investigators spoke to LeTonya's friends, and everything sharpened. Multiple people in her life confirmed what some had already suspected. LeTonya had been talking about leaving. She wasn't broadcasting it. She wasn't building a public case against her marriage or making dramatic announcements. She was telling the people closest to her, quietly and seriously, that she was done. That she had made her decision and she was working up to making it real. That single detail reframed the entire case. Because if LeTonya was planning to leave, if Michael knew or felt it or sensed the distance she was putting between herself and the life they shared, then the question was no longer simply whether a fight had gone too far. The question became whether someone looked at the woman walking toward the door and decided, consciously and deliberately, that she wasn't going to make it through it. The forensic evidence reinforced that interpretation in the most clinical and damning way. The angle of entry, the proximity markers, the position of the weapon relative to LeTonya's body, None of it matched the disorganized, uncontrolled discharge of a weapon mid-struggle. It matched someone standing close, someone steady, someone who aimed. Panic makes a mess of a room. Control leaves it exactly as it was. And this room had not been touched. Michael Keith Bradshaw was taken into custody and formally charged. And the moment it became official, two very different realities collided outside that courthouse. Inside, Michael stood before the judge the same way he had presented himself since the beginning, quiet, still, giving nothing away. No collapse, no visible grief, no moment where the weight of what he was accused of seemed to land on him in any human way. He looked like a man waiting out a situation, not a man facing the consequences of the worst thing he had ever done. Outside, LeTonya's family came undone in the way that only people who have lost someone violently can, not just from grief, but from the specific suffocating weight of knowing it was preventable, that she had been right there, that she had been planning to leave, that she was so close to getting out, and she never made it. The community responded the way communities do when something breaks open in their midst and forces them to look at things they would rather not see. Vigils were organized. Candles were lit on sidewalks near the house where she died. Posters bearing LeTonya's face were carried by people who wanted her name to stay in the air, to not dissolve into a case number and a court date and a memory that faded before it should. And quietly, uncomfortably, people who had been near the edges of her life started to sit with their own reckonings. The neighbors who had heard the arguments and told themselves it was none of their business. The friends who had noticed she seemed off and hadn't pushed hard enough to know why. The people who knew something was wrong in that house and hadn't found a way to say it out loud. Hindsight in cases like this is brutal. In the courtroom, prosecutors built their case on the physical, proximity, trajectory, forensic evidence that told a story of intention rather than impulse. The defense pushed back with narrative, escalation, emotion, a fight that spiraled beyond anyone's control, a man who snapped in a moment and has to live with it forever. But the evidence kept returning the same answer. Impulse leaves wreckage. Panic leaves chaos. What investigators found in that bedroom was neither. It was stillness. And stillness in a room where someone just died means something very specific. That house is quiet now. No voices bleeding through the walls into the neighbors' living rooms, no arguments that start low and climb, no sounds of a marriage in crisis pushing through the ordinary sounds of an ordinary street. Just silence and the particular, permanent weight of everything that silence now holds. LeTonya Gidney Bradshaw was 49 years old. She had a life full of people who needed her, who relied on her, who described her in the kind of terms that make a person feel like they failed her just by not doing more. She was tired. She was trying to find her way out of a situation that had become dangerous in ways she may not have fully named yet, even to herself. She was close. She never made it. And that is the part of domestic homicide that never gets easier to say, not for investigators, not for families, not for the people who cover these cases and try to make sense of them afterwards. It is almost never a surprise. There are almost always signs. There are almost always people who saw something, felt something, heard something, and found a reason to tell themselves it wasn't their place. Domestic violence doesn't begin with a gunshot. It begins with control, the slow, suffocating process of one person deciding that another person's autonomy, their choices, their right to leave, does not belong to them. It builds in small moments that seem survivable. It escalates in patterns that feel from the inside like something that might still get better. And it ends too often in rooms that look exactly like the one LeTonya died in.
ordinary rooms, in ordinary homes, on ordinary streets, where neighbors have heard the arguments and told themselves it would be fine. It is not always fine. The case against Michael Keith Bradshaw moves forward through the legal system at the pace those systems require. Evidence is reviewed, arguments are made, the process does what the process does. But for LeTonya, the woman who showed up for everyone else, who was quietly, seriously, resolutely trying to find her way to the door, the outcome is already written. She deserved to walk out of that house on her own terms. She deserved the life that was waiting for her on the other side of that decision. Say her name, share her story, and if someone in your life is living inside something that feels like what LeTonya lived inside, don't wait for the silence. If this story reached you, if it stirred something in your chest, don't let it fade when the video ends. These cases remind us that danger can hide in the everyday, that silence can cost lives, and that sometimes the smallest voice can be the one that saves someone. If you know anybody in a violent or unsafe situation, don't wait. Say something. Call for help. Speak up. Your voice might be the one thing standing between someone and a tragedy like this. Drop a comment, share this video, keep their names alive, and we'll be back with another story that needs to be told. This is the Exposed Crime. Stay safe out there.